Blog Talk Radio.
Are you there, Rob? Are you there? Okay, well, we're waiting for Rob to chime back in. I don't know what happened. Everything went out, it came back, went out and came back. Lost everybody, had to log back in. So hopefully folks will chime back in. Again, thank you very much for your patience. I didn't touch anything. I didn't touch anything when he came back from, well, when I came in from him giving his short bio, everything went flat. And I couldn't hear, he couldn't hear, and the show just kind of went crazy. But we're back, and I hear some scuffling around.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. We're back, and I'm like I said, I'm not touching anything, but we're going to continue. Let's just get right back. Let's get right into, because we lost about 15 minutes. Let's get right into the Black Panther here, its origins and things like that. So, kind of give us a little background of the man who actually, brought us to Black Panther. Jack Kirby, his ties to the whole World War II thing and stuff like that, and bring it into the Black Panther.
Well, from what my experience with it, because I was a big Jack Kirby fan during the '60s, and I read most of his stuff from Marvel, and becoming interested in him as an artist, because his art style, probably inspired more professional artists, comic book artists, and he also kind of laid the foundation for how Marvel Comic, the storyboards and the layouts and how the action was done. He kind of created the formula for that. In the mainstream, most of the credit for the Marvel comic book universe is given to Stan Lee. And that's the name everybody knows. And even today, if you talk to a lot of the people that are into the Marvel comic book cinematic universe, or even a lot of the people that read the actual comic books, Stan Lee is pretty much known as the creator of, Marvel Comics, in terms of he's given credit for creating, the Fantastic Four, which kind of started it all, and then he's given credit for the Hulk, the Avengers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. From what my experience on the inside of the comic industry and knowing a lot of the actual professional comic book writers and artists that worked at Marvel, and talking to some of these people and hearing some of the side stories down through the years, the inside stories, the consensus of opinion on it, in my opinion, and I'm basing my opinion on some things that I know personally, Jack Kirby was actually the guy that was the creative genius behind Marvel Comics. And that without him, Marvel Comics as we know it wouldn't exist. And that includes the Black Panther. Okay? Now, the way that you can kind of tell that this is true is that if you look at the careers of Stan Lee, or Stanley Leibowitz is his real name, and back in the 1930s and 40s when Marvel Comics was known as Timely Comics, The publisher of Marvel Comics was a guy named Martin Goodman. And Martin Goodman was Stan Lee Lieberman's uncle. So Stan Lee was the nephew of Martin Goodman. And he was kind of a young kid at this time. Okay, and he was maybe the guy who went out and got the coffee and the donuts and the guy who ran the errands and went to the copy machine and that stuff. He was not a professional writer or artist at this time. We're going now back to the golden age of comics and back to the 1930s and 40s. Jack Kirby was already one of the early comic book creators that was already doing, a lot of stuff back then as a professional. And one of the things he created at that time period that is an icon of comic book characters that we still know about today was Captain America. And he created that totally separate of any association with Stan Lee. His partner at the time was a guy named Joe Simon. And together with Joe Simon, they created Captain America. They created the Newsboy Legion for Marvel Comics' rival, which was National Periodicals or DC Comics. They created a number of things back then. So basically, Jack Kirby was creating things way before Stan Lee wasn't wet behind the ears yet, So then World War II comes around, and ironically enough, Jack had predicted the America's entry into World War II in the Captain America comic book. So when the Captain America comic book had Cap fighting Hitler and punching Hitler out on the first, the cover of the first issue and all this stuff, America wasn't actually in the war against Nazi Germany at that time. And yet that comic book predicted that we were going to actually wind up in it. So basically the war breaks out and everybody goes to enlist, and Jack, like every other red-blooded American, enlisted in the military armed forces, and he winds up going overseas and he winds up fighting in World War II. Then World War II ends, and Jack comes back home. But now there's something a little different. During the 1950s, when the superheroes kind of fell out of favor and horror comics and science fiction comics began to kind of take over as the entertainment fare of the moment, Jack wandered around at that time, and he did a bunch of different things for a bunch of different companies. He did a bunch of breakthrough things that had never been done before. He even started doing black romance comics, which is something that had never been done before. And this just goes to show you how innovative and creative the guy was. He then went back to national periodicals, and because the science fiction movies were starting to, in the 1950s, in the wake of the atomic bomb, you had a lot of movies about giant mutated animals and flying saucers, and all of these things were making it big in the movies at that time. Jack started a strip for national periodicals called The Challengers of the Unknown. And the Challengers were basically 4 adventurers. Some of them were scientists, some of them were explorers, some of them were kind of daredevil airplane pilots and deep sea divers and mountain climbers and whatnot. And he got these guys together, and supposedly the story goes that they were on an airplane that crashed, but they all survived. And the thing was that they said, well, for some reason, fate had us survive this, so we're living on borrowed time. So they wound up teaming up to kind of just do all these fantastic explorations of the unknown. And that became a big, thing over at DC Comics with a science fiction theme to it, where they would do everything from uncover lost civilizations to fight all kind of mutated monsters to run into aliens and giant robots and pretty much the whole plethora of what the 1950s sci-fi B movies covered. They ran into it in The Challenges in the Unknown. And in one of those stories, they wound up becoming exposed to some type of chemicals or vapors that actually temporarily gave them superpowers. Now, I say this to say that he did this story before. This story predates the creation of the Fantastic Four. Yet, Jack had already pretty much created a team of explorers who got exposed to some type of chemical element that gave them elemental type superpowers. When one guy got turned into rock and another guy got turned into vapor or flame, or the other guy was some kind of water elemental. It was only temporary. It was one story he did. But he had already created the template for the Fantastic Four
years before,
way before he gets to Marvel Comics. Okay, so this goes to show you who really is the genius behind it, because the Fantastic Four is, of course, the comic book that kind of launches the modern age of Marvel Comics. Okay, later on, if you look at the whole association between Jack and Stan. Now, Stan is the guy who's writing the dialogue, but in terms of the characters, the design of the characters, and the plot, the story, what the story is, I believe Jack was responsible for all of it. I believe Jack was responsible for 75% of what Marvel Comics became in the early days. That includes the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the X-Men, the Incredible Hulk, all of it. I think all of that was 75% Jack, maybe 25% Stan. And I really believe that. I kind of, to quote one of my comic book artists, buddies, that if Marvel comic book was a cake, Jack is the cake and Stan is the icing. Right? So without Jack, you don't have a cake. And I absolutely believe that, because if you look at what Jack did before he got into this creative relationship with Stan in the 60s, he had already done many things. And then Stan, before Jack, had done absolutely nothing. There's nothing major. There's no major comic book character or comic strip or anything associated with Stan Lee before Jack Kirby. Okay, so what
was the background? So what was the Black Panther background that Jack Kirby brought to it? I mean, secret Illuminati stuff, secret Illuminati stuff, some World War II declassified or classified documents, or how does this hook to the real world?
I'll say this, that okay, there is, and people are going to find this incredulous, but there is some evidence to back this up. When Jack came back from World War II, he started doing these stories for Marvel. And in some of these stories, I would say some of it in the Fantastic Four, but a lot of it in Captain America, when he revived the Captain America character, because Captain America had been in limbo for decades after he had already created the character back in the late 30s, early 40s. So they decided to bring Captain America back in the 60s. And the methodology they used was to have the Avengers discover him frozen in a block of ice. They get into a fight with the Hulk and the Submariner, and the Submariner is angry because he lost the fight with the Avengers, and he sees a bunch of Eskimos with this guy in a block of ice, this figure in a block of ice, and he picks the block of ice up and hurls it into the Gulf Stream, where the warm waters in the Gulf Stream, the ice melts, the Avengers are in a submarine trying to find the Submariner, and they wind up seeing this man floating in the water. They pull him into the submarine, he revives, and under his tattered army uniform, they see the shield and the costume of Captain America. So this is how Captain America winds up being revived in the 1960s Marvel Universe, and he's been a part of it ever since. Now, within the pages of Captain America's own strip, which he kind of got his own strip after that, and Tales to Suspense, Jack starts to unleash all of this stuff about the Nazis, the Red Skull, Dr. Arnim Zola, how they're creating all these super weapons for the Third Reich, and how Cap and Bucky are constantly trying to shut them down and stop them from doing this, and all of this, you get all of these things that you think is just science fiction, but later on it turns out that a lot of the alternative historians, especially connected with the alternative histories of World War II and what actually happened during the last days of the war, the kind of technology the Nazis actually had, the fact that America may have co-opted that technology by bringing Nazis to the United States during the period between 1945 and 1955, including the Peenemünde rocket scientists that actually wound up getting us on the moon and revamping our entire, or actually single-handedly creating our entire thermonuclear ballistic missile program. All of that stuff that happened during the Cold War turns out to be German technology. Well, Jack is talking about this stuff in the comic books, especially within the pages of the Captain America stories, and later he creates another storyline called Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos, which is about a commando unit in World War II that later this Nick Fury character becomes the head of a super secret spy organization called S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, Jack laid the foundation for all that, but later on you have an artist-writer named Jim Steranko, and Jim Steranko comes along and he takes the whole S.H.I.E.L.D. thing and he kind of runs with it, and he's the one that turns it into kind of Marvel's version of James Bond. But Jack is the guy that laid the foundation of it. And Jack is telling this story, and he's sprinkling it through the pages of various Marvel comics. And so you're starting to get this picture that, okay, the Nazis may have been a lot further along technologically than anybody knows, and that the United States may have benefited from that by co-opting those scientists, both in terms of weapons research and in biological research, in terms of experiments that the Nazis were doing in the concentration camps during the 1930s and 40s, right up until when they lost the war. They actually were trying to create super soldiers. They actually had two separate super soldier programs. The first one was basically using a chemical concoction of testosterone, methamphetamine, cocaine, and some other drugs, and they came up with this capsule or this pill called DIX, and they were going to use it to amplify the strength, pain tolerance, and endurance of the soldiers. And they tested it first on the concentration camp inmates. They would have them march around wearing heavy packs for hours on end, and when they took this formula, it enhanced their stamina and strength to the point where they were able to do this for hours on end. Now, many of the concentration camp inmates died as a result of being pushed to their limits like this, but they wanted to test it to see what would this do to the soldiers. So this was one of their first kind of biochemical augmentation of their soldiers that they planned on doing. There was a separate program also taking place in being tested in the concentration camps, but this one was something that was even more effective, and eventually I believe that this was co-opted and brought to the United States during the 1950s. They had something called Project Monarch, which basically they were trying to find a mind control methodology to create super soldiers and super assassins through a process of mind control and hypnosis. And that program eventually became an American mind control program under the CIA, which the CIA had been formerly the OSS. And then under Wild Bill Donovan and Allen Dulles, when they signed the National Security Act, they made it possible to have a central intelligence agency who basically dealt with foreign threats to the security of the United States, as the FBI deals with domestic threats to the security of the United States. So when they signed the National Security Act into being, that allowed them to create the CIA. And Allen Dulles became the first director of the CIA, and it was under his leadership or his orders that they created the American Mind Control Program called MK Ultra, which was kind of an evolved version of the German Mind Control Program, which was called Project Monarch. So this is kind of the history of it. Well, Jack actually is, a lot of this stuff, Jack is actually putting in those comic books, which leads one to believe, well, how did he get hold of this information? For instance, there's two characters that he created that were the enemies of Captain America, and these characters are still enduring, and they wound up making it into the actual Captain America movie, the first one and the second one. And the characters were the Red Skull. The guy in the comic book, his name is Johann Schmidt, and he has there's another Nazi scientist named Arnim Zola. And basically, if you look into the writings of the British writer Tom Augustine, and there's an American writer named Joseph P. Farrell. And these guys are very interesting in that they have written a lot of material on the post-World War II, what you would call the official version of what happened during the last days of the fall of Nazi Germany, versus what they believe to be the true story, which was then covered up, and you got a fabricated version of everything from, they hid the fact that they got hundreds of Nazis out of Nazi Germany that should have gone to trial in Nuremberg as war criminals, and they changed the information on these people, because at the end of the war, you had Harry Truman was the president, because Roosevelt died, and the vice president, Harry Truman, became the president. And Truman, realizing that there was a plan to bring some of these Germans into the employ of the United States, because a lot of them had skills. I mean, the Germans had the first guided missiles or rockets, and nobody had rockets back in World War II, but the Germans had them. And so there was a
jet
whole
airplanes
lot of things
also.
They had jet airplanes. They had a lot of things that the United States and the British and the Russians did not have.
Yeah, and Rob, what about, and how did this go into George Patton? General Patton wanted to go into Berlin and Eisenhower and all of that. How did that come? And folks, we're giving the Marvel background and the background of Jack Kirby.
We would have to really get into that. Well, I can skim over it, but to really get into the detail or the meat of it, we'd have to do a show just about that, because that whole thing is actually really fascinating, and it's very different from the history that most people who are interested in this type of stuff, the official line that you get on it, or what you get in school, or what you get from the official history books, most of that is either fabricated and or it just leaves out so much that it is kind of like lying by omission. So most of what most Americans have in their mind about how we beat the Nazis in World War II and how we won the war and how we came up with the atomic bomb and dropped it on the Japanese and all this, a lot of that just didn't even happen that way.
Well, skim it real quick, so that, because we want to do another show and we want folks to come back to hear this other information, because this is all part of it. What I'll do is
I'll drop a few I'll put it like this. This is the truncated version of it, that basically near the end of the war, the Nazi intelligence, German intelligence, contacted the OSS by some means. And someone in the Nazi high command that was in the bunker, where Hitler and the other members of the Nazi high command had retreated to, as the Germans were fighting their way back to Berlin to make their last stand, because without going into a lot of the military history of it, the Germans had initiated something called Operation Barbarossa, which called for them breaking the peace treaty they had with the Soviet Union and actually attacking Russia. And this turned into a disaster because they were not able to beat the Russians. They thought it would be a quick fight and it would be over with quickly, and they weren't able to do that, and the Russians made a comeback. And so the Nazis were caught in a war on two fronts, on the eastern front with the Russians, and on the western front with the Allies coming in through Normandy after Eisenhower, who was at that time the commander-in-chief of the Allied offensive in the European theater of war. He was the top military commander. He had given the green light to the Allied invasion of Normandy, which we know as D-Day, when the Allied forces crossed the English Channel and they attacked Germany, and that set up the whole Western Front offensive. Well, the Germans were now caught in a kind of pincer situation with the Russians coming at them from the Eastern Front and the Allies with the United States and Canada and Australia and Britain and whatnot coming in from the Western Front, and they got sandwiched between these two fronts, and as a result of this, they ran out of resources, they ran out of money. They had a lot of these super weapons in production, like the jet airplane, like different kinds of transatlantic bombers, that they couldn't even get these things off the runway because they didn't have the fuel, they didn't have the money. But that didn't change the fact that they had technology that, had they had the chance to bring these things online, it would have changed everything. I'm talking about everything from guided missiles to possibly even functional flying saucers. And I know that sounds like science fiction. Well, anyway, all of this stuff starts to get really interesting when the Germans, realizing that they can't win the war, and the primary reason they can't win the war is because even though they have these weapons, none of these weapons are capable of crossing the Atlantic and actually hitting any targets in the United States. There is some evidence that the Nazis may have even developed the atomic bomb way before the Americans did. and that the American atomic bomb may only be an offshoot of the German atomic bomb, in fact, that we may have gotten materials and technologies from the Germans that allowed us to actually create the bomb. And that before that, we were not actually anywhere near making a fission bomb. So the problem was that, okay, if the Nazis had all this, then why didn't they use it? Well, the V-2 rockets didn't have enough thrust, or they weren't big enough to carry a warhead across the Atlantic. Meaning the missiles that the Peenemünde rocket scientists came up with, they could hit things within a certain range. Meaning they could fire things from one part of Europe to another part of Europe. But they could not cross the Atlantic. They were not yet at the level where they had intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they weren't able to, the range was too limited. So even with an atomic warhead, they wouldn't be able to hit anything in the United States. They did have a bomber that they thought could make the transatlantic flight, but it only got it to within, I think it was about 250 or 300 miles outside of New York, and it had to turn around and go back because they ran out of fuel. They would have run out of fuel, and they wouldn't have been able to make the return trip. So they basically did test it, but the bottom line was Germany didn't have anything that was capable of crossing the Atlantic and hitting the key targets, the key industrial targets in the United States that would have taken us out of the war, because the major thing that we brought to the war was our manufacturing capability. We could manufacture more tanks, guns, planes, uniforms, rations in 1 month than Germany could manufacture in a year, which was one of the major reasons why Winston Churchill was pretty much practically begging Roosevelt to get in the war, because he knew that without the American manufacturing capability and the American resources, that Britain could not sustain the war against Germany. France had already folded, and Britain was still in the fight, but they would not have been able to beat the Germans on their own. Absolutely not, without the Americans getting into it. And that was primarily because of our industrial manufacturing capability. Well, if the Germans couldn't take us out of the war, then there was no way that they could win the war with us in it. So they realized near the end that they weren't going to be able to beat us. So what they did was they cut a deal. And the deal was, if you get the top honchos in the Nazi party, if you let us get out of here, we'll come to work for you, because your next big fight is going to be with the Russians. And the Nazis hated the Russians. They hated them on a racial level because they were Slavic people and they felt that the Slavs were subhumans. They hated them militarily because at the end of the day, it was really the Russian offensive on the Eastern Front when the Russians counterattacked that actually cost the Nazis the war. And they hated them ideologically because they were, communists, so to speak. So they were ready to parlay and do business with the Americans more so than they wanted to let their technology and themselves fall into the hands of the Russians. They would much prefer to fall into the hands of the United States, and for various reasons. So basically, they cut a deal with the American military intelligence, and they let them know where certain caches of these advanced weapons could be found. And they even let them know the location of a certain submarine that was on its way to Japan, carrying materials and the scientists that created the fast-acting fuses needed to create the initial explosion that causes the heat and the compression that gives you the actual fission reaction to make a fission bomb. The United States, as of 1945, possessed no such fuses. So they wouldn't have been able to make an atomic bomb anyway. Even if they could have gotten enough weapons-grade uranium or plutonium, they simply would not have been able to cause the fission reaction because they didn't have the fuses to do so. Well, those fuses did exist, but they had been invented and patented by a German scientist as far back as, I think, 1935. Now, you can read a lot of this information. There's an author named Joseph P. Farrell. I think I mentioned him already. There's another guy named Tom Augustine. After the fall of communism in 1988 and the Berlin Wall went down, the East German archives of what really happened, or what their take on what really happened after the fall of Nazi Germany and what happened between 1945 and 1955, those archives suddenly became available to Western writers and historians. And what came out of, getting that information changed the entire take on what really happened after the war. Now, how this ties in with Jack Kirby is, if you read the comic books, that Jack Kirby is actually plotting, because Stan Lee's not writing these things. Stan Lee is he's doing the dialogue, but the plot and everything that's coming behind it, it's not him, because if you look at everything he wrote before Jack came along, there's nothing. There's nothing of note. And then after he and Jack part company in the early 70s, when Jack goes back to work for DC Comics because he feels as though he's being stifled at Marvel, and he also feels as though he's not being financially compensated, he's not being appreciated, so he winds up leaving Marvel and he goes back to DC. After that period, there's nothing coming from Stan Lee that anybody remembers that's prolific. Stan Lee created absolutely nothing on his own before Jack, and he created nothing of any note after Jack. And that's not for lack of trying. He just never created anything that caught on. So that's how you know that Jack was the magic in the formula. But Jack's getting his magic from someplace, and that someplace is quite possibly that during the war, Jack made friends or made contact with people that were connected with the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, or the Allied Military Intelligence. Things that he may have learned during that period, which would have been a matter of national security if he talked about them, somehow he decided to put them in comic books, because if you put this in a comic book, nobody's going to believe it anyway. It just makes great. In other words, the stuff was so crazy yet real that nobody would have believed it anyway, so why not put it in a comic book? And so that's apparently what he did. If you look at the characters, the Red Skull and Arnim Zola, for instance, you can find their real-life analogs in the Nazi SS commander Hans Kammler, who was actually the man who was in charge of all of the Nazi super weapons projects. And his partner was a Dr. Heinrich Voss. Wilhelm Voss. If you look at Wilhelm Voss and you look at his background, and you look at the character Arnim Zola, you'll pretty much see that that's basically, he's the same guy. Except, the comic book version is a little more hype. So you've got Hans Kammler and Heinrich Voss, Wilhelm Voss, and what happens is, if you look at the history of it, Kammler was actually a civil engineer. He's the guy that designed many of the concentration camps that the Nazis were using. And at some point, Heinrich Himmler convinces Hitler to make Hans Kammler the head of the special Nazi secret super weapons program, including the Peenemünde rocket scientists. So you're talking about Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger and all of these guys. Basically, Himmler convinces Hitler to put all of that under the authority of Hans Kammler. So Hans Kammler becomes the head of this super secret Nazi research weapons organization that's so top secret, and the projects that they're working on is so top secret, so classified, that even most of the top members of the SS had absolutely no knowledge of what this stuff is. So that if you look at the Captain America movie, the one that they put out in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and you look at this whole thing with the Red Skull and how he has a separate organization within the SS that's not answerable to the SS, which they call Hydra, right? Well, Hans Kammler's real-life organization, his real-life top-secret military research projects within the SS is pretty much the same thing. It's so top secret that even the top guys don't know anything about what's going on. Now, his partner, Dr. Wilhelm Voss, the two of them met up after the Nazis annexed part of Czechoslovakia. There was a Czechoslovakian weapons research plant called the Skoda Weapons Facility, and it was located in Pilsen. And they sent Kammler to take over that facility because they were reverse engineering technology that they had captured from other countries, military technology, planes, tanks, guns, whatever. And what they would do is that they would enhance the technology or rebuild it and make it better. And this is Dr. Voss was the top guy in that facility in terms of his relationship with the workers who spoke Czech. They didn't speak German. So when the Germans took over that facility, he was kind of the go-between guy. And he winds up teaming up with Hans Kammler, and together they take this whole super weapons technology thing to a whole nother level. And they wind up using Nazi slave labor, just like they was depicted in the movie, and they basically hollow out mountains so that these weapons facilities are in a series of caves underneath the mountains where they build these facilities so that they'll be protected from any kind of bombing raids from the Allies. The Allies won't be able to hit these things because they're underground. And they use slave labor from the camps to do the work. Well, all of that's depicted in the Captain America movie, and if you look at the comic books, a lot of it's also in the comic books. And that goes back to Jack Kirby, not Stan Lee. So that's just a quick summary. It's just the sugar on the donut version of it, But, one day we'll do a show, maybe we'll get more into detail, and I can give you some dates, times, facts. But one of the things that the tying this in with the General Patton is near the end of the war, where the Nazis were retreating back to Berlin, and the general consensus of opinion amongst the Allied military commanders was that the Nazis were going to make their last stand in Berlin, and they were going to fight to the death. And basically, General Patton's Third Army was headed in that direction when he got a directive from the top brass saying that they wanted him to redirect his army into the mountains, the area called Thuringia, and that the Nazis were going to make their last stand in that area. And he thought that was ridiculous. He was like, why would the Nazis make their last stand in Thuringia? They're trying to protect Berlin. So what really the scuttlebutt behind that is, the Allied intelligence had gotten some type of information from the Germans telling them that there was a weapons facility with all kind of advanced tech that they would be able to co-opt and use in their coming conflict with the Russians. Because you got to remember, the Russians now, as they're advancing from the east, they are gobbling up all of the eastern territory that the Nazis had formerly held. They're coming in, and as the Nazis are retreating, the Russians are moving in. Now, the Russians are not liberating anybody. They're not liberating Poland. They're not liberating Czechoslovakia. They are coming in and they are taking over and doing pretty much the same thing that the Nazis did. And Patton is seeing this, and he's saying, you know, we got to stop these bastards. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later, so why not hit them now? Now, they redirect
Well, we got all the everything already over there. You don't have to take it all the way back to the United States. All the way back to the United States and bring it back again.
Into it because remember, Patton's army is the one that finds the weapons, the secret Nazi super weapons facility. He's the one that finds it. So when he sees what these guys are working on, and he realized that the Americans can, kind of engineer or finish the process and basically make these things, he's saying, with this kind of technology, nobody will be able to beat us. So this is probably one of the reasons why he wants to then go into Russia and take the fight right to them. Unfortunately, the official version is that Patton, at one point, he becomes the military governor of Bavaria in the days following Germany's surrender. And he has Nazi prisoners of war that he is training and forming into an army to go into Russia and invade Russia. Meaning he's saying, you know what, if you don't want to use American troops, if you don't want to make it look like we're attacking these people who maybe nominally were our allies, and the Russians really weren't our allies. They just happen to be fighting the Germans, and we happen to be fighting the Germans, but that didn't make us allies. And Patton absolutely saw it that way, and he saw that their whole ideology and the whole way that they were doing things, he didn't really see it as them being our allies. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. So real quick, Rob, I want to do a commercial here.
Don't mean that they're the good guys.
Hold on one second. I want to do a commercial here. Thank everyone for bearing with us in our whatever it was. I don't know if the AI jumped in trying to stop us or what. But this is the Entheogenic Explorer program, and we're here with Rob Henson talking about the Black Panther. And the way I set it up was that we'd have an hour of background and an hour of Black Panther, and we're going to go into the Black Panther's strength. We're going to go into how even dealing with the concepts with the Black Panther, anabolic steroids were created. We're going to go into Africa with the Dogon and the Congo, and dealing with entheogens, dealing with the Black Panther. So in 11 minutes, we're going to roll right in there. We're going to go for about 45 minutes. Then we're going to have some questions from the audience, because I know you all want to chime in. Don't forget that we do have this year coming up the Food of the Gods tour that's in Mexico, which will be smoking the toad and eating the mushrooms, the thunder mushrooms from the mountains in Mexico. And we'll also be having this year's conference, the Detroit Psychedelic Conference, in August 10th, 11th, and 12th in Detroit. So the website is up. The DetroitPsychedelic.com website is up. You can go to the website, find out what's going on. You can also get your tickets. We have pre-ticket sales that are very, very inexpensive, and they're going fast. So get your tickets, and we're going to be going right back to Rob. We have to bring him back in because as soon as I got off, they chopped him out. So let me bring him back in so we can get into this Black Panther. It just needed laying the groundwork of Jack Kirby and how he had access to this information. So let's bring Rob back in. Rob, you back?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Let's roll into this Black Panther because we don't have because we lost some time when we had that blackout, or excuse me, the whiteout.
Yeah.
Whichever way you want to do it.
Which way you want to call it.
Black
right.
Black is always there. Light, the one that's got to come. But so let's get with Jack Kirby and get into this Black Panther and its origins, what Jack was trying to convey at the time, the synergy of it happening right at the same time, real close with the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense with Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seals in Oakland, and the tune of the times coming into 67 Summer of Love, and we're dealing with entheogens, psychedelics, dealing with the Black Panther, and they have this whole thing about the heart-shaped earth, talking about Black men being things like that, of course. When we deal with Black Panther or Panther power is actually a mushroom, Amanita Pantherina mushroom. And let's get into the Black Panther part of it here.
Okay, well, I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing a little bit of an echo in the background, so I don't know if that's a technological glitch or what, but you can hear me pretty clear, right?
Yeah, you're pretty clear. I'm gonna shut up, and you can go right ahead, and we can get into this. And
so the first thing is I'm gonna relate to your audience is that Jack actually had designed the Black Panther, and coined the name the Black Panther probably about at least a year or so before the Black Panther Party called themselves that. So that's one of the things, he didn't name the character after the actual political party. He had actually even at some point wanted to change the name so it wouldn't be associated with the Black Panther Party as the Black Panther Party became more prominent. But he actually had already created that name for the character
prior to.
And I don't think he based it on the Black Panther Party.
No.
Hello?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing you. It wasn't based on the Black Panther Party. It was prior to that.
No. But now, I do think it is based on something. I think it's based on a couple of things. Jack was a very well-read individual. And thanks to the war, he was well-traveled in terms of he went overseas and saw lots of things that during the war inspired him to create all kinds of different comic book characters, not just the Black Panther, but he related the story of what it was that caused him to create the Incredible Hulk. Once again, another character that Stan Lee takes credit for creating, but actually Jack's the guy who created the Hulk. And he went into a story of how he saw a baby that fell out of a car and was trapped between the car and the edge of the gutter, and how the mother, trying to retrieve the car, had literally lifted this car up to get this baby. And in seeing that, he said there is a superhuman strength that lies dormant in most people into an emergency situation calls it to the surface. And he went, what would happen if you took that thing and isolated it and gave it a form? And that idea stuck in his mind for years, and then eventually he wound up using that idea to create the Hulk. And I'm sure that, Stan added some flavor to it. Stan might have thrown the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde element into it to some degree or whatever. I'm not taking it completely away from him, but I'm saying I think that the alchemy behind the character mainly comes out of Jack, like most of it does. Well, the Black Panther is the same thing. Jack probably had, now we can't prove this, but Jack possibly had information on the warrior tribes of Africa, particularly in the southern hemisphere of Africa, when we're talking about the Zulus and the Zulus' use of entheogens in order to enhance their prowess in battle. Everybody is familiar with the Zulus due to their warlord, Shaka Zulu, who pretty much conquered the entire southeastern hemisphere of Africa in the late 1700s. So you're talking about something that wasn't commonly known in the West, which is the use of entheogens to enhance the physical and mental prowess of warriors. But this was something that was starting to come to the fore in American literature. If you start talking about the writings of Carlos Castaneda and him, there's a lot of talk and if you read those books, of course, the Indian Druho that is the mentor of Castaneda in these books, Don Juan, introduces Castaneda into the use of entheogens. And one of these entheogens, he is able to combine his essence with the essence of various animals. Okay, so the use of entheogens to do that is something that's, as you well know, and people who study these things know, that this is a staple throughout entheogenic culture throughout the world. It's the origin of the whole myth behind the skinwalker in the Southwest with the Native American tribes of the Southwest. It's also the origin, if you go farther, if you go into Europe, behind the werewolf or the bear clans amongst the Viking berserkers. All of these things are based on entheogens. So it would be no mystery then that Africa and the entheogenic culture in Africa and the entheogenic warrior culture in Africa would also have various methodologies of doing the same thing. And so Jack, being a well-read guy, simply put that in the Black Panther comic book. Stan Lee would never have come up with that because I don't believe Stan Lee is that open-minded or that interested in non-white, non-mainstream, white American Eurocentrified culture. Whereas Jack actually explored everything, and you can look at it. Stan Lee, on his own, did not create any multi-ethnic, multiracial superhero. He didn't. Not before and definitely not after. Jack, on the other hand, not only did he create the Black Panther, but when he went back to work for DC Comics in the 70s, he was so well known and so much of a staple of comics in general. Many comic book writers and editors and artists were inspired to become professionals based on the work of Jack Kirby, to the point where there's a saying in the comic book world that you have Jerry Siegel, the guy who created Superman, which started it all. You have Bob Kane, the guy who created Batman, arguably the other most famous comic book character in the history of comics. And then you have Jack Kirby, the man who created just about everything else. And that's pretty much, the way it is. So that shows you just how big a piece of comic book history that Jack has attributed to him, in that if you take Jack out of American comic books, American comic books, as they exist today, don't get to happen. That's how much of a contribution he made in terms of the way things are drawn and the way things are done. And many of the top artists, people like Il Kane, Johnny Ramita, all of these guys will tell you and testify to the fact that, you know, yeah, in the early days, I got my style or my ability to tell a comic book story, particularly with comic book action sequences, mainly from Jack Kirby. That he's the guy that kind of inspired them to do all that. So it's getting back to the Black Panther then, when you're talking about creating non-white superheroes, that was something that was not done in the comic book industry, because the comic book industry, just like every other industry and institution in America, was heavily controlled and affected by white supremacy. We live in a predominantly white supremacist culture. And so, you know, the way black people and other people of color, you know, Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, comic books, movies, even history books did not center on a three-dimensional depiction of anybody but Caucasian people. Everybody else was kind of just a side dish or subsidiary of. Thus, depicting non-white characters as three-dimensional human characters who could run the gamut of human attributes, including heroism, it just wasn't done, it just wasn't seen. Most of the non-whites depicted in comics, movies, cartoons were caricatures. If you go back, the further back you go, the worse it gets. So basically, Jack was kind of in a class by himself in that he was creating black African superheroes, Asian superheroes. When he went back to work for DC Comics in his Fourth World series, which is, you know, anybody that has seen the recent Warner Brothers Justice League movies, the villain that they were fighting in the last Justice League movie, Steppenwolf, was a creation of Jack Kirby. Okay? The mother box technology that's central to the plot of, and I don't want to give away any spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen it, so, you know, this is a spoiler alert if you haven't seen the Justice League yet. Basically, the mother box technology that is a central part of the plot, that's the creation of Jack Kirby. The parademons that are featured in the movie, that are the bad guys in the movie, that is a creation of Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby created all of that when he went back to work for DC Comics after he left Marvel in the early 70s. So this man just went on and continued to create and create and create, and we're seeing these things on the screen now. Not only is most of what you're seeing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe basically Jack, but also a lot of what you are seeing in the Warner Brothers DC Comics Cinematic Universe is also Jack. So that's how prolific he was. So that's how you know Stan Lee was not the guy coming up with any black African superheroes or anything of that nature. So Jack is probably the guy that did the research and basically put together the template for the Black Panther. And I think he got it from two sources. I think he got the general culture of Wakanda is based partially on the Zulus, because T'Challa's father is named Shaka. Okay, so that's a dead giveaway right there. And Wakanda is somewhere in the southwestern or southeastern hemisphere of Africa. The geography of it, you know, kind of changes back and forth depending upon who's writing it. But you know that it's somewhere in the southern hemisphere. And the idea that they are a tribe that has this cosmological metal, this vibranium that supposedly crashed onto their land thousands of years ago, and through the use of this super metal, they were able to create technology that was, hundreds and hundreds of years ahead of anything that not only anybody in Africa had, but anybody in the West or in Asia had. Which is why in the Marvel cosmology, the Wakandans are a warrior tribe of people who have never been conquered by anybody. And they, based on this super metal, they have created this super engineerable physics. Well, I think he based the Wakandans, at least in part, in the warrior aspects, he based them on the Zulus, but in the technological aspects and their understanding of science and cosmology and physics, I think he based them on the Dogon tribe, which if anybody wants to get a handle on just how important the Dogon are and the kind of things that they had access to, you would want to read a book called The Cirrus Mysteries, because that would basically introduce you to the Dogon tribe and basically how there's these two French anthropologists during the I believe the 30s that they go there. They hear that these people have a cave where there are carvings in the cave that are depicting kind of like a intergalactic map of the Sirius star system, and they basically have the juxtaposition of Sirius B in a position, in an orbit that NASA, years and years and years, decades later, but this is all before there was a NASA space program. NASA eventually, they get the Hubble telescope, and they are able to actually see the same configuration that the Dogon had thousands of years ago, and the Sirius B is in the exact position they said it would be in. So, it's like, how could these people possibly have this? Now, of course, later on, there was a movement by certain European disinformation specialists that kind of water it all down and say it didn't happen and disclaim it or whatever. But, again, that's just basically them in 2020 hindsight trying to clean something up. That's inexplicable. How could these black people who admit that they migrated from Kemet or from Egypt and that they have all of this tremendous cosmological knowledge, and it makes sense because if you look at the pyramids in Egypt, they are constructed to be aligned with the Sirius and Orion star systems. So something's up there, So the Dogon, again, not only did they have information on the, star system of Sirius, but they also had information on the composition of super condensed matter, like the type of matter that comes out of a collapsed star and how it weighs millions and millions of pounds per square inch. They had that information. They had information about the physiology and anatomy of the human body. That's just they just had all of this information that these primitive people. How could these people be primitive and have all this information? So the white anthropologists and other people went there and tried to figure this out. And there's a famous book about it. And again, I encourage people to try to look that up and read it. But I think Jack had already been either led into that by some of his contacts in the intelligence community, or he may have actually just decided to study it himself because he was one of those people that realized, unlike the comic book writers of today, most of the stuff coming out of comic books today is garbage because most of the people who write the comics today base the comic books on nothing but other comic books. Whereas the really interesting comic book stuff, the stuff that's groundbreaking, the stuff that changed the industry, like Alan Moore's, Watchmen series, it's all based on actual history, politics, science, philosophy, things that the comic medium is just being used as a platform to actually say something that's thought-provoking and meaningful, rather than just people wearing tights beating the snot out of each other, you know, like. Or today they don't even do that, because the other thing that fell out of kind of fell off the wagon in the comic book industry is the ability to actually create action sequences that are entertaining, because you've got, you know, those guys that wrote comic books back in the Golden Age and the Silver Age, they were artists and writers, but they were people that had lived some real life. They went off and fought wars. They grew up in rough neighborhoods. They knew what it was like to get into a fight. Most of these people writing comic books today have never been in a fight in their life. So how are you going to write super fights between superhuman people and you've never been punched in the face or you've never even done a push-up? So that's why most of the action in comic books today is uninteresting, unrealistic, and simply just plain flatline. It's like most of these comic books have been turned into kind of what you would have if you had a superhero soap opera. In fact, I would go on record as saying that, with the exception of the stuff that Jack Kirby did in the 60s and 70s and some of the other writers, people like Stephen O'Hara, people like Roy Thomas, you know, the people coming out of that, people like Lin Win, who I think passed away not too long ago, these guys were really in an industry that encourages hackism, because you got to come up with 32 pages every month, 22 to 32 pages every month. And that kind of would drain anybody's creative process. Yet these guys, you know, told a pretty damn good story. And the comic books back in my day only cost about 25 cents. Today, comic books cost anywhere from $4 to $5. And you get no story that's worth, pardon my French, it's just not worth much even in, you know, Russian money. It's not worth anything. And, you know, everything is hyper drawn or hyper delineated, but there's no story. When I grew up, reading a comic book was almost like sitting at home looking at a movie, because of the way the panels were laid out and the way they conveyed information even without dialogue. These guys today can't do any of that.
Well, these guys today haven't really read the corresponding literature and novels and the areas dealing with the heroes of old and things like that. They don't know about Nimrod,
even though all of it's available.
Hercules, you know, the different works of, you know, Herodotus, you know, all the different things that are background. You know, they're not even familiar with Conan and Doc Savage and well,
they're not interested in
Alan Quatermain and all of the things that, you know, were before the internet and before big budget CGI movies and things like that, where your CGI was reading Alan Quatermain and Conan and things like that, you know, that exhibited the hero.
Well, again, you got to look at the guys that created that, though. You know, guys like H. Rider Haggard and, you know, Robert E. Howard and P. Lovecraft, and, you know, I mean, these guys are from a different era, and most of them were plugged into history and into the occult. And so that's why they were able to create these worlds and these heroes and these visions of things that, because they were actually based on something. Again, most of the comic book writers today are writing comics based on other comics. And that's pretty much it. And that's why it's kind of going nowhere fast. The other thing all of them are trying to be Alan Moore, because Alan Moore is the British writer that created the groundbreaking event that took comics from being kind of a subculture into mainstream culture with his graphic novel, The Watchmen. So basically, since he did The Watchmen back in 1985, it's arguable that they haven't done anything of that caliber since. And even the few things that have been done that you could say come close haven't been done by American writers. With maybe the exception of The Dark Knight Returns, which also came out around that mid-'80s, and we're talking about Frank Miller. And pretty much, other than that, most of the interesting stuff that has come out of comic books in America have come from predominantly British writers. People
what
like
what are your
Ellis,
thoughts on? Yeah, what are your thoughts on the upcoming Black Panther movie, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and tying the Black Panther into the Infinity Wars and things like that?
Well, first, getting back to the Black Panther himself, again, I think Jack based the creation of the character on those things I talked about, which is what makes the character so interesting. Because the Black Panther doesn't simply have the kind of background that the average superhero has in terms of, let's say, somebody like Batman. Batman is a character who, based on what happened to his parents, was driven to turn himself into this, vigilante superhero. And, of course, because his parents were rich and they left him a vast fortune, he has the economic resources to do all this. And because one of the holdings of the companies he owns is a scientific research and development company, Wayne Industries or whatever, and there's this black guy named Lucius Fox that is the head of that research development division. He has all of these advanced weapons technologies available to him to use in his fight against crime. But the difference between Batman and Black Panther is that Batman can only do what he could learn in a single lifetime. And even if you give the allowance, the literary, what they call it, the suspension of belief, in that they're going to tell you that Bruce Wayne's not an ordinary human being. He's a genius with a photographic memory. So this is how he could start all of this somewhere between the ages of 10 and 11 years old. And this is if you want to buy that Alfred Pennyworth, who became his actual legal guardian, was actually going to let some 10-year-old kid jet set all over the world so he could train under this karate master and that ninjutsu master and this ace detective and this criminologist and all these things, that you were going to let some 10-year-old kid do all of that. We have to be realistic that Batman probably didn't start his training even for his career until he got maybe about 14, 15 years old. So you're talking about he's in elementary school to junior high school when he starts all this stuff. So if he starts his career by the time he's in his early to mid-20s, even if you give him a genius-level intellect and a photographic memory, he still doesn't have the time to learn all of the skills that they're telling you that Batman has. That he's a world-class martial artist. He's a world-class weightlifter and bodybuilder. He's a world-class acrobat and escape artist. He's a criminologist. He's a detective. He's an engineer. He's a biochemist. I mean, it gets a bit ridiculous that you could buy it within the time frame that he's supposed to have learned all this and then actually is able to actually execute it. Even with all the money, it just doesn't fit into the chronological time frame of anything a human being could do. The Black Panther is different in that the office that he occupies. The Black Panther is not one man. The Black Panther is a title that goes back hundreds to perhaps even as much as 1,000 years. There has been these men taking up the mantle of the Black Panther. And through the Entheogens, every Black Panther that has ever existed and everything that they learned can be accessed by the current Black Panther, because there is rituals that they go through where they can contact their ancestors, and so all that information is downloaded into them. So not only does T'Challa have all the knowledge and the techniques and the skills that he himself has learned in one lifetime, which can easily equal anything that Batman could come up with, because he's got, if anything, more money than Batman, because the Wakanda is one of the richest nations in the world because of the vibranium technology, but he's been groomed to be this thing since childhood, and it is within his cultural agenda to do this, starting as early as maybe 6 years old, whereas, arguably, Batman, Bruce Wayne wouldn't have started training to be Batman until he was at least 14, 15 years old. Alfred Pennyworth would not have allowed him to even do any of that. So at the end of the day, T'Challa has been training technically longer than Batman has access to more money, and has access to technology that's beyond anything that Batman has access to. But at the end of the day, T'Challa also has, through the rituals and the entheogens, he has the spiritual reservoir of knowledge of everybody that's ever been the Black Panther. All of these people who are in his bloodline. So these people are all his ancestors, because all of the Black Panthers come out of the royal Wakandan bloodline. In fact, through eugenics, they have genetically, through selective breeding, they have created a physiological or biochemical state where they are the only ones who can ingest the entheogen, the panther herb, which I know you're going to go into and explain that is an actual real herb. That's not science fiction. That panther mushroom actually exists. And the royal family in Wakanda, they can absorb this mushroom without the toxic effects of it killing them, whereas anybody else who tries to take this thing, it'll kill them. So this thing actually links all of them kind of in a genetic, connection, past life connection, ancestral connection. All of this is coming through this. And Batman is just one guy. There's no succession of Batmen. He's the only one. So he's got nothing to draw on but his own experience. Whereas the Black Panther is actually, it's almost like you're fighting, if you're fighting him, you're fighting every Black Panther that's ever existed. And it's going all the way back thousands of years ago. So, that's where it's kind of interesting. And again, Jack Kirby laid the foundation for this, but you had a number of writers come along and add pieces to it. So in the 70s, you had a guy named Don McGregor, and he did a run on it. And a lot of the characters you're going to see in the Black Panther movie, Eric Killmonger, for instance, is a creation, I believe, of Don McGregor. There's other characters that are going to be in it that other people added to it. So basically, you also are going to have a lot of stuff in it that's going to refer to. There's a writer named Christopher Priest, who I actually met back in the 90s when he was an editor at DC Comic Books, and basically when he went to work for Marvel and he went to work on the Black Panther book, he added a whole lot of detail and a lot of things to it that became fan favorites, and thus they have now become canon in the Black Panther storyline, and you're going to see a lot of that in the movie. For instance, the Dora Milaje, who are the female bodyguards of the Black Panther. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that might have been Christopher Priest that actually came up with that. A lot of
which are based upon the women fighters in Dahomey.
Well, the Dahomey and the Benin Amazons that were actually the king's bodyguards, which is something I'm waiting to see somebody make a movie out of, because those female Amazons from Dahomey that fought the French, that's a story in and of itself, and that's something that most African American people don't know anything about. Most white people in America, of course, don't know anything about it because they don't know much about our history at all. Not that they're not interested, they've just been disenfranchised from it in terms of the school system and everything else. They don't teach anything about the history of African people, not really.
And some great works that should come to the movies, such as The Witch of Remote Town by Amos Tutuola, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, different works, The Master of the Forge, all of these works that are epic in the class of, Lord of the Rings and things like this, that are African writers.
It's African folklore along the same lines as the European folklore, and it's just as epic and it's just as heroic. But because it is coming out of African literature, African history, these things, of course, are not really promoted over here. But maybe this movie will change that. I'm thinking, because already the scuttlebutt about the movie. Well, I've heard a couple things. I don't know if you've heard these things yet. And again, I haven't looked totally into them. But one thing I heard is that the advanced screening of it is that the movie absolutely hits all the high points that everybody's expecting, meaning it's going to be a total mind-blowing success. It already outsold in terms of the advanced ticket sales. I think it's outsold every Marvel movie ever made. And when you consider that the first Avengers movie was the third highest grossing movie of any kind in history, with the exception of Titanic and Avatar, which are two James Cameron movies.
Yes.
The Avengers,
I think Avatar is the highest grossing.
So you've got Avatar, you've got Titanic, and then you've got the Avengers. Those three are the highest grossing movies of all time. I don't know if the second Avengers movie actually eclipsed that or not, but I know that at one point the Avengers was in third place. So the Black Panther, another Marvel movie, has outsold so far the pre ticket sales. The advanced sales is sold out.
Yes,
so
definitely.
That's
real quick
that,
real quick, because we're down to a half hour. I want you to just hook the Black Panther into the cinematic universe real quick, and what they're moving towards doing with the Infinity Gauntlet and the Infinity Wars. And then we're going to take some questions. Well, it's kind of hard because you don't know exactly what they're doing, but just from the
I can take a good guess at it just from looking at what they've done already, and then looking at what they've done in the comic books. And anybody that's from my generation, which is the Generation Xers, the people born in the late 50s, early 60s.
Well, I think you're a baby boomer. Baby boomer.
Well, maybe I'm a baby boomer, but we kind of grew up on these comic books, so we didn't come into the picture kind of just here recently in the last 5 or the last 10 or the last 15 years.
Yeah.
we read everything, going all the way back to the 1960s before a lot of these Generation X people that are in the, well, some of the Generation Xers and definitely the millennials kids that are now really deep into the Marvel Cinematic Universe and all of this current boom in comic book to movie projects. Basically, there's the movie cinematic versions of all of it, and then there's the actual comic books where the material is being coming from. So if you read everything and you look at the movies, you kind of can predict kind of sort of where they're going with it. So in just in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion because, you know, Kevin Feige and all these people who are, you know, really orchestrating this, they are following the comic books pretty closely, which is one of the reasons why the Marvel movie franchise has been so successful. And whereas maybe the Warner Brothers cinematic universe has not been quite as successful because Marvel actually understood the essence of what made their comic books sell. Why would anybody want to see any movies about these characters in the first place? What makes them iconic? And they were able to kind of capture lightning in a bottle. And they pretty much, because they are the first comic book company to actually own a movie studio that they bought for the express purpose of turning their comic material into movies.
So they're actually the comic book people. They're actually the comic book people are doing the comic book movies.
And go real quick. People are controlling the movies for the first time.
Real quick,
they're driving the process.
Yeah, go into real quick. I know we're going to have a lot of time. We're going to have to do this again, but go into the comic book character that really was the first successful comic book movie that kind of brought it all together. That would be Wesley Snipes with the Blade movies, and that's kind of what started it all, which it doesn't get the credit that it should get, but Blade was the first Marvel comic character to become a successful movie franchise. And it's incredible because Blade was one of their lesser-known characters. He was not one of their mainstream characters. For instance, the Black Panther is one of their mainstream characters. Yeah. Wakanda is a big, big, big part of the Marvel comic book universe. And it's interwoven in with everything. For instance, Captain America's shield is made partially out of vibranium. Well, in the comic books, it's a fusion of two different super metals, adamantium, which is what Wolverine's claws are made out of, and vibranium, which comes out of Wakanda. So that ties Captain America into Wakanda and into the Black Panther and all of that. And Wesley was supposed to originally do. Wesley was originally supposed to do the Black Panther also. So that's kind of like his whole from what I understand from you know, and you and I we're getting this from the horse's mouth because you know you were, in case the people out there in radio, blog, talk show land don't know this, Kilindi, who is one of the foremost martial arts teachers and practitioners in the world of authentic African martial arts, not Chinese, not Korean, not Japanese. Not that I'm saying anything is wrong with those martial arts, but Kilindi was probably single-handedly the man who brought authentic African martial arts to America in terms of our understanding of them as arts unto themselves that are equal to anything that has come out of Asia. So basically, he was the guy. He was the first black man to make the cover of Inside Kung Fu magazine. So I'm just trying to put that out there. He was also Wesley Snipes' bodyguard. He's not going to tell everybody that, but I'm going to put that out there. And it was through him that I had got a chance to have some association with Wesley. So Wesley's the whole scuttlebutt
behind him and Blade is that he really, at the peak of his action movie career, he wanted to do a superhero movie because, you know, we had never had any black superhero movies or any depictions of people of African descent as superheroes on the big screen. It had never really happened other than, say, Robert Townsend's Meteor Man movie was about as close as we had ever gotten. And that was more of a comedy than it was like a straight-up, you know, drama. So Wesley went to Marvel, and I guess because he might have been a fan of Marvel as well, and he wanted to do the Black Panther project, but he couldn't do it because at that time Marvel did not have a movie studio. They were still predominantly a comic book company. And they had a habit of licensing the rights, the cinematic rights to their characters to different movie studios for a certain amount of money, and then that studio would have the option of making the movie, and they had a certain amount of time in which they had to do something with the option, or the rights would revert back to Marvel. That's what happened with the Fantastic Four movie that Roger Corman made, that never even made the screen and went direct to video, because he got the rights to it, but in order to hold on to the rights to it, he had to make some kind of movie before they ran out. So he slapped together that thing that he slapped together with some kind of paltry $1 million budget that didn't do it justice, and of course it was garbage. But he only did it to hold on to the rights. Well, somebody had the rights to the Black Panther along those same lines, and unfortunately, the script that they were working with was that they wanted the Black Panther to be a janitor in a black high school in an inner city urban neighborhood who puts on a Panther costume to fight drug dealers, which is an extremely watered down, incredibly uninteresting, incredibly lackluster idea if you take what the Black Panther in the comics actually. You're taking this guy from being an African king of an independent high-tech nation, and you're turning this guy into some guy that works in a high school in some ghetto neighborhood where he's fighting drug dealers. So naturally, Wesley didn't want anything to do with that. So in lieu of waiting for the people who had the rights to it to either make that silly movie and bomb, and or the option run out so that he could then maybe purchase the rights to it, he wanted to do something else in the waiting period, and he wound up choosing the Blade character because he thought, obviously knew that he could make this character interesting, even though the Blade was like a second or third tier character. Blade was a character that appeared in a comic book called Tomb of Dracula, and he was a supporting cast character. He's not even American. In the original comics, he's British. And he basically becomes a vampire hunter because his mother was attacked by a vampire while she was pregnant with him. And due to an enzyme in the vampire's blood that entered into her system and affected him, he is impervious to vampire bites. And he also has a certain amount of enhanced strength and athletic ability. And in the comic book, he basically fought vampires with sharpened wooden stakes that he would throw like knives. He did not use a samurai sword, none of that. Wesley added all of that to it. He jazzed the character up. He made him a martial artist because Wesley himself has martial arts background, and that wound up creating the Blade that everybody knows and loves. So he actually jazzed the character up and made him more interesting than he ever was in the comic books.
Rob,
a little bit of the history.
Yeah, a little bit of Blade history. Rob, let's take a few questions because we're getting low here. at the end of the hour. So let's grab a few questions and see if we can get some folks in there. Hopefully the AI doesn't jump in and try to mess our questions up. We're going to go to the area code 847. Let's see if we can get the person from the 847 in. Yes, 847. Do you have any questions for Rob this evening? Thanks a lot for coming on the show. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Not you, Rob. I'm talking about the 847 person, 847 area code.
Okay.
Okay, 847, are you there? Yes, are you there? You got any questions for Rob? Okay, we're going to move on. Let's move on to 520 area code. 520 area code. Do you have any questions for Rob here?
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, what's the question? Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about the Soul Stone theory. I don't know if you've seen it a whole lot, but the Avengers Infinity War kind of let a hint towards maybe Thanos coming down and trying to attack Wakanda. Maybe like Black Panther might have some access through his ancestors to the Soul Stone. What do you think about that?
They may tie that in like that because the whole thing with Thanos is, and again, it's brilliant that Marvel did this from the very first Avengers movie, that they made it clear that Thanos was kind of, behind everything that was happening. And that they started showing all these tie-ins to the Infinity Gauntlet, even as far back as the first Thor movie, when you're looking at Odin's trophy room and you kind of see the Infinity Gauntlet or some version of it in the case, letting you know that, this thing exists. And then out of the series of movies, every one of these movies has had as the major MacGuffin some piece of the Infinity Gauntlet. And of course, Thanos is trying to, get these things just like he did in the comic book. So they needed, if you got somebody as epic as the Avengers and all of these, superheroes that are on the Avengers, Thor, the Hulk, Captain America, Iron Man, and now you've got the Black Panther and, the Black Widow and Hawkeye and all these things. You've got to have something of earth-shaking impact for them to go up against. And, of course, Marvel is tying it all in. They're letting you know that, Thanos is going to have to come to Earth because not only is there one piece of the Infinity Gauntlet here, but there may be two, because that the Vision has one because he's got the Mind Gem.
Right.
And that's that. In the comic books, of course, it was different, but they kind of wove it into this cinematic version. And we also know that Loki probably also has a piece because he has the Tesseract. So, which is probably why Thanos is going to attack Thor and the Asgardians, as per in the last Thor movie after Ragnarok. They show Thanos' starship closing in on them near the end credits. Now, again, spoiler alert. So yeah, I think that they are going to probably tie in Wakanda as having some piece of the technology that Thanos is after, and this is why he's going to attack them. But he could also just simply be attacking them because, Thanos is not somebody who wastes his time doing anything that doesn't have a reason behind it. He's a master supervillain of cosmic proportions. And shout out to Jim Starlin, because Jim Starlin is the guy who created Thanos and a lot of the modern, what you call, cosmological universe. So that's a lot of that attributed to Jim Starlin. And basically, Thanos may be attacking Wakanda simply because he realizes that most of the nation's military forces on Earth, pose no threat to him. But Wakanda, with their super advanced technology, would, and thus maybe that's why he's attacking them.
Okay. All right. Well,
so that could be, but I would definitely not rule out what the young lady is saying, that they may have plotted it so that there is a piece of the Infinity Gauntlet somewhere in Wakanda. It absolutely it could be.
Or the Slow Tone. Thank you very much, 520. We're going to move on. We're moving on to the 347. 347. Do you have a question for Rob this evening?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Peace and how you doing? This is Banu.
Real good.
Yeah. Rob, do you think how they're gonna play in the whole confrontation between Captain America and the Black Panther? How do you think they're gonna play that in the movie?
Well, they've already shown you that they're not going to have a confrontation between Black Panther and Captain America. They already did that in The Winter Soldier, and the whole reason behind the conflict being that the Winter Soldier was at least thought of as being the assassin of T'Challa's father in the Winter Soldier. So they kind of changed the comic book somewhat, because in the comic book, T'Challa's father, T'Chaka, was killed by Ulysses Klaue, the character that Andy Serkis is playing. That's who killed him in the comic book, and T'Challa became the Black Panther to avenge himself against Ulysses Klaue for the death of his father. He was also the reason why Ulysses Klaue lost his hand. Ulysses Klaue was a Dutch adventurer, scientist, and villain who was trying to invade Wakanda in order to get the vibranium, because he believed that he could make sonic or sound-based technology based on it. And he killed T'Challa's father because T'Challa's father would not trade the vibranium to him. And T'Challa actually grabbed his gun as a child and he blew Claw's hand off, which is why he had to replace it with a prosthetic that he later turns into a sound-based weapon. Eventually, his experiments with sound turned him into a monster whose body is composed of solid sound. And all of this happened in the Fantastic Four comic book with the Black Panther, where the Black Panther was introduced. So this is all part of his origin story in the comic book. In the cinematic universe, they changed that, and that his father was killed by the Winter Soldier, or it was engineered to make it look like the Winter Soldier killed him. And the Black Panther, of course, wanted revenge on the Winter Soldier. Captain America is the Winter Soldier's best friend. Thus, it brought them into conflict against each other. So that's basically how it happened in the cinematic universe. So they already did that. But at the end of the Winter Soldier, Captain America had actually taken refuge in Wakanda, and so did the Winter Soldier. And so basically, if anything now, the Black Panther and Captain America are actually buddies.
Yeah, they're on the same side.
They're on the same
what they
side.
said from the trailer and what they had from the trailer.
That's why in the trailer, somebody gives this man the shield. You know.
Yeah, that's right. So we're gonna be moving on to the next question. So we know that Cap and the Black Panther are going to be on the same team. Let's move to the 718. 718. Do you have any questions for Rob? Because we're moving down to the last moment. Make it quick.
I just want to thank you for an incredible show. Incredible. I learned so much, Master Kilindi, brother. I mean, this is epic that we need to know this information so we can pass it on to the youth. So I just want to say thank you again.
Oh, well, thank you for helping out with the advertising and having me on the show all the time and stuff like that. So we're gonna keep it moving, and we still gonna have to put this together to get Rob on your show. So we're moving to the next.
Let's make it happen.
we're moving to the 702 area code 702. Do you have any questions for Rob? 702. Okay. Moving right along. We're going to move to the
from 702.
702. Excuse me. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I never had the opportunity to read the comic book. I guess I'm one of the younger people. Just hearing about this history, this backstory, I always felt connected to it. And just hearing this conversation has really some awareness and clarity. Now I feel like I have to go back and read the comic book. And I want to ask, my question is, will there be a replay? Because I want to look into some of the different resources that you, Brother Kilindi, shared as far as the different books and other materials are available.
Yeah, it's going to be, you'll be able to go back on Blog Talk. It's being recorded, so you'll be able to go in and go through it. We're going to do a part 2, folks, after the Black Panther comes out. So before the end of the month, we're going to have Rob back on where he can, just kind of break it down and things like that, and then go more into the history and background, because there's so many different things that we just can't cover in one show. We got to go into the development of super strength with myostatin inhibitors and how steroids anabolic steroids were created for this, and so many things. So thanks a lot for your question. We're going to move on because we only got a few more minutes left. Let's move to the 646. 646, do you have any questions for Rob? 646? 646 going once, twice, thrice, and we're going to move on. We're going to take one more question. Let's move to the 516. 516, do you have any questions for Rob real quick? 516 area code? 516, we can't hear you. Are you there? Yeah, 516, what's your question?
Yeah, I'm here. I just want to thank you guys having this show. I'm a younger person as well. I just want to thank you guys for the in-depth knowledge. I'll definitely be listening to part 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Rob, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. All right, we're rolling down to the end of the show. As I said, we need you folks to look into on the website DetroitPsychedelic.com, because of course we're having our Entheogenic conference in Detroit August 11th, 12th, and 13th, and we're also in June having the Food of the Gods tour, where we're going to the Olmec, Toltec, Aztec, Mayan areas of knowledge and information with entheogens, and also with the sacred toad medicine, smoking toad, and also eating the mushrooms on a long weekend in June up in the mountains overlooking the ocean, staying on the side of the mountain. So that's coming up. So we need you all to come on in and participate. We're not having a lot of people on this. It's going to be a short list. So chime on in. Also, you can catch me on Facebook. A lot of you are my Facebook friends, or should be, will be, and things like that. We want to thank Rob for coming out. We're going to let him end it up. Also, we are taking donations to keep the Entheogenic Explorer show going, to help, deal with the cost of the show, and also with adding new and improved areas to the show. So you can PayPal us at kilindi@hotmail.com on PayPal, and you can leave your donation of $10. We take Bitcoin, Ethereum also. Bitcoin and things like that is down, so it's a good time to buy. But you can get us a donation on kilindi@hotmail.com, KILINDI@hotmail.com, and PayPal, and donate to help keep this type of information going. All right, Rob, let's pull it out on some of the things, some of the other things you're going to be talking about as we go on throughout the year, because we're going to have you. We're going to have you.
Well, I appreciate that, Kilindi, and I will definitely make time in my schedule to be back on the show. I thank you for bringing me on, and I enjoy sharing these things with the community out there, whether it's to be the comic book community or the general community. Because, like I said, although this stuff we're talking about comics and movies, there's a lot of things that are real world that are behind it, as you well know, and that's what I want to emphasize. In fact, I was talking earlier tonight before I got on the show with a friend of mine who I won't say, this person's name, I won't say her name, but when it comes to people with superhuman abilities, I have actually in my lifetime run into these things for real. I know that's going to sound kind of crazy and maybe people thinking, I'm smoking some dope or something, but I have had some experiences that I would say are paranormal, and even some people who are paranormal in some sense. So I had talked to this individual, and again, I don't want to say their name. So even when I do refer to them, I'm going to use an assumed name, and I'm going to, if she ever decides to do the show with me, we probably won't use her real name because of some of the things she could do need to be off the radar. But so, there are people and things and situations out there, and as you are saying earlier when you were referring to the myostatin and steroids and things like that, we are on the cutting edge of something called the transhumanistic movement, as you are very familiar with it. And there's not a lot of people who are familiar with it. But one of the reasons why Hollywood is producing all this comic book material, there's three reasons behind it. The first is that a lot of these people who are directing these things and producing them grew up with these comic books, and it just so happens that the technology to actually make these things realistically on screen has now actually become available. So a lot of these people are doing it because, I grew up with this stuff and now I get a chance to actually, make a movie about it. But there's another reason behind it. And that reason behind it is that basically science and genetics, nanotechnology, biochemistry, these things have gotten to the point there are real scientific research projects that have been going on for the last 10, 15, 20 years that started with the mapping of the human genome that happened around 2006. And after the human genome was mapped, a lot of things just became available that weren't available before. And so a lot of these superheroes or superhumans that they're making these movies about, what they're not telling you is behind the scenes, they're actually trying to make these people for real. They actually are making and creating technologies that will yield these kinds of things. DARPA, the Military Defense Agency research projects, the Advanced Research Projects agencies for the military that actually makes a lot of their military hardware, they've already made a super soldier. It's in the first stages of it, but they've already got a guy who basically has an armor that's similar at low levels, not quite what Iron Man has, but it's above anything that has previously existed. And
Rob, we'll have to put this for the next show because we're down to 60 seconds. I'd like to thank you for coming on. I'd like to thank everybody who was part of the show this evening. Your questions, bearing with us when they shut the stream and dropped us off. But thanks a lot, Rob, for coming out, and I'll talk with you real soon. And everybody else will be back. We'll be back on the Entheogenic Explorer program next week. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you then. Peace.